Thank you.
Welcome. We're going to get started. Welcome to LEAP's first speaker series event of this semester. I'm Daina Bray, the legal director of the Law, Environment, and Animals program here at Yale Law School. I'll be moderating today. Thank you to our speaker, Dr. Alexandra Horowitz. Thank you to Naomi Jennings. I don't know if she's in the room, but oh yes, she's done tons of coordinating for this event. And thank you to this audience. This is a wonderful turnout, and as you can see, we're thrilled to hear from you today. Also at the outset, I'd like to acknowledge our co-sponsors for their support and collaboration of this event. Thank you to the Poynter Fellowship in Journalism for their support, and to all of our co-sponsors, the Yale Animal Law Society, the Yale Environmental Law Association, Yale Environmental Humanities, Yale Journalism Initiative, Plant Forward Yaleys, and the Yale Sustainable Food Program. Please be aware, I don't know what's going on there.
The subway?
I don't know. Hopefully, we'll update you if there's anything you should know about that. But please be aware that this event is being recorded. We'll record the whole event, but we will only post the speaking portion to our YouTube channel. We will not post the Q&A portion. Also, I hope your food is delicious. All of the food being served today is vegan, including the cookies. Please enjoy. And we will have time for questions and answers following the talk. So please save your questions, think about them, and hold them until the end. Dr. Alexandra Horowitz is a senior lecturer and the head of the Dog Cognition Lab at Barnard College. She is the author of the New York Times bestseller, highly recommend, Inside of a Dog, What Dogs See, Smell, and Know has really made me think about my dogs differently. And 4 other books. She's written on a fascinating range of topics with a true clarity of voice. It's very thought-provoking to read her writing. She's written about fairness, guilt, captivity, cloning, and play. She's written about how animals are represented in children's books and things people say to their dogs. She's currently working on her 6th book, which is a book of biographies of individual animals, tentatively entitled Encounters with Animals, and which we have the pleasure to hear about today. So thank you, Dr. Horowitz.
Thank you, Daina, and thank you to Naomi for arranging this and for the LEAP program to inviting me and all of the various co-sponsors, which I think has brought probably a diverse group of people here, so I appreciate that. I study, as Daina said, I study dog cognition, which means I study the behavior of owned domestic dogs and try to make inferences to what they know and understand. And I run the Dog Cognition Lab at Barnard College. And so most of my writing is about that. Today I'm going to present a work in progress. So actually I'd be delighted for feedback or thoughts or suggestions, as you'll see, suggestions for animals. You'll see that will be relevant in a second when the Q&A comes along. And you're not being recorded, so you can say whatever. This work in progress is a book of kind of biographical profiles or portraits of animals. And because it's in progress, for better or worse, I won't be standing here and reading from my book. I want to share with you a little bit of the messiness of a book in progress and how I got from, I want to write about non-human and non-dog animals to what it is becoming. So my provisional title is, as Daina said, Encounters with Animals. And I realized that I accidentally came up for this idea of an animal encounter or an animal experience from the thing that often zoos pitch to potential visitors, right? They pitch to, especially to have sort of a behind the scenes, right? Experience with an animal. And there's so many things that I find odd or even inexplicable about this. I mean, these animals' lives are not their own in any way. They are captive. But also, in this case, meeting or encountering them here means seeing up close or maybe touching. I guess it's an encounter, but it's not one where the animal is at all revealed. So how to reveal an animal while keeping their welfare and interests in mind is something that I want to do in this book. And I'm approaching it more as an essayist than as a scientist, But some of the issues, I guess, that I'm dealing with, in my mind, are very similar to those inherent in my science, which is to say how to ask questions of animals that they can respond to, and what questions are even relevant to ask them, rather than asking them human questions that would be relevant to asking about human lives. And I had some conditions for my book, as kind of setting myself up with an Aleppo-like, challenge for writing. One is no talking animals, no pretending that they're talking, no glossing what they're doing as speech, because I think that's obviously the fundamental flaw of a lot of our thinking about non-humans, is that if only we could sort of understand what they're saying, and we're trying to gloss what they're saying as though they have our language or concerns or would use any of the words or categories that we use. So that's condition one. And the second one is I want to be in this as little as possible myself. I have an aversion to putting myself in their story. It's not about me. A big part of my research with dogs is trying to understand what they're like around humans, yes, but how they are also importantly different from humans. To see the dog for themselves, not as someone who is interesting to us because they are appended to us or because they are apprehended by us. So these chapters won't be my octopus story or my heartwarming relationship with a tortoise. Hopefully the chapters tell the tortoise's or the octopus's story, ideally mostly without me. So this has forced me to consider why and how untraditional subjects can be written about to engage an audience. And that made me think about the art of human subject profiles. Some have inspired me, also have challenges. So I'm thinking about something like Frank Sinatra Has a Cold, which, if any of you know, was a profile of Frank Sinatra by Gay Talese, where Frank Sinatra would not grant him an interview. And so the entire profile is built around the non-getting of an interview with the subject. That's inspiring. And Susan Orlean's American Man, Age 10, where she profiled, as though he were a celebrity, a 10-year-old boy. So there, too, you have the challenge of finding what is relevant to them that will also be interesting to an audience. What we have in common, me and the people profiling humans, is that we're both translating the world of somebody else. In my case, I just think the other is further away. But compared to human profiles, there are some pros and cons in profiling animals. For instance, a con, or I guess maybe a challenge, is that they don't tell me anything. This is a huge source of material when interviewing a person. I don't have their words to draw on for information about their life, or to infer or state what they are thinking or feeling. Animals are not self-reporting in this way. And when an interview ends with a person, there's actually a great liminal space where you keep the tape recorder on, and a lot of things happen there. So you miss that framing of an interview and sort of the time outside of the interview when the person can be themselves with an animal. So that's a challenge. I have no chemistry with the animals. A lot of profile writing is the chemistry of getting into a room with a person and them unfolding themselves through conversation. The piece includes the dynamic between the writer and the subject. And here it's a lot more one-sided, right? The animal is not a participant in that way in the profile being written of them. Third, while we're both translating the world of someone other, we can take nothing granted with animals. With people, we know what it's like to be a person, and we can extrapolate. But what is it like to be a beaver, or a cuttlefish, or an ant? What's significant in their life, and even just the frame of their life, might not be what it is for me. They have a fundamentally different Umwelt, I would say, or worldview. I have limited access to my subjects. Sometimes I have no access at all. There's no publicist setting up interviews for me, and there's very little paper record often of their life. Another con is that my sources are more repertorial and less gossipy about their subject. So in other words, sometimes in writing a profile of a person, a friend or a source on that person says, I probably shouldn't say this, but, and that's gold, right? my sources are very sincere in talking about the animals that they know about. They're not trying to tell me the good, juicy stuff about the animals' lives. But I also have some advantages in writing about non-human animals instead of humans. One is that they're egoless. Maybe I'm anthropomorphizing. I think that's correct, though. They don't know I'm writing a profile, and they don't care what I write, fundamentally, right? People can be flattered, and animals seem incapable of being flattered. Maybe this is also a con in a way, because sometimes a person will work with you to open up more, to get a more flattering piece. But I think this actually is an advantage. Animals don't try to control the narrative, right? They don't try to tell me who they are or how they see things. They aren't inclined to lie. They have no artifice, I would say. Whereas humans definitely try to tell you the story that they think you should tell about who they are. And another pro is I get to spend time with animals. It's all this time, and I think this is really what the project, where it originated, was just my interest in knowing more animals and thinking about their lives. So I want to tell you a little bit about who I've written about thus far. And again, as I say, this is very much a work in progress. So in preparing to talk to you today, I actually had a realization about my project that I hadn't had before. The subjects I've chosen both represent and demonstrate reasons that animals haven't previously been the subject of biographical portraits. Some of these reasons overlap with my cons above, and they also overlap with reasons why animals also might not be given certain consideration in our society, to have rights or to be worthy of good treatment, and so forth, which is germane to those of you who are considering animals legally. So I'll introduce a few characters who I'm profiling by introducing their reason. Let's start here, coming off of the zoo animal encounters. One reason that animals have not been subjects of biographical portraits is that they serve as ambassadors. They kind of live as models or as stand-ins. In other words, they're meant to be representatives of their species for our education and edification. And so we don't need to consider them. Their lives are about, in a sense, showing people that other members of their species or other species have lives. It's paradoxical, really. So the animal who fits this category, who I profiled, is Owlet 151, a Eurasian eagle owl who was hatched in 2010 as a part of the American Zoological Association's Species Survival Plan trademark breeding program. Not because they're an endangered species, they are actually of least concern, according to the Audubon Society. But the breeding program is based on institutional needs for the nonprofit and for-profit institutions where they're kept. So at 7 weeks old, Owlet 151 was brought to the Central Park Zoo in New York City and named Flacco. He then lived first in one corner of the zoo and then in this enclosure for 13 years. It's about the size of a bus stop. As per the AZA SSP recommendations, the approximate minimum housing dimensions for a single ambassador eagle owl are 3 meters by 3 meters by 2.5 meters. Note that their wings, when outstretched, reach to about 2 meters wide. So I thought a lot about what it might be like for Flacco to live there for 13 years. For instance, never hunting, being provisioned with deceased food, never soaring, because there's no room for him to spread his wings and fly. What it's like for a nocturnal bird to be on display all day, every day. He was also a stone's throw away from a mechanical clock in Central Park, which on the half hour chimes a tune. Hickory dickory dock, Eau Claire de la Lune, all day. 13 years in, there was a turning point for Flacco. Someone cut open his cage at night, and Flacco, for the first time, flew away. Eau Claire de la Lune. He was noticed missing after hours when he alighted on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, And he spent the next year living in Central Park and making guest appearances at other perches in Manhattan. He never returned to the zoo. I live in Manhattan, so this was actually a subject I could interview, as it were. He was findable, and I spent hours observing him, as did many others, including some photographers, one of whom took this awesome photo. Very chuffed looking there in his tree. Flacco was probably my easiest subject in a way. He was captive, so observable, for most of his life, and even when no longer captive, he was still on display. He kept himself publicly visible. And then this becomes part of his story, how he was defined as a representative, as an entertainment in the zoo. And then in his release from that stage, watching him define himself. So my method for this is very much first-person observation, coming to know his habits, how he typically acted, where he could be found, and the notable moments in his life, such as when he eluded capture several times, as representatives from the zoo tried to capture him with food, with other owl calls, with a cage. He escaped it all. Or when he left the park and his admirers in the park and appeared on a windowsill 2 miles away. Another source of information about him was just the genealogical information that zoos keep about their animals. But they don't have any observational data, interestingly, that could tell me about what his day-to-day was life. They don't keep that, or they don't release it. Of my subjects, he is also one of only 2 zoo animals. And I guess more specifically, he's one of several who were or are captive animals. Another reason that some animals haven't been the subjects of biographical portraits is that they're raised to be food animals. Their use is being food for us or our pets. And that's the beginning and end of it. And so we don't need to consider them. Their lives are not about living. They are about hurrying up and growing into the size where they are most profitably killed for food. Not this one. This is Ari. When I met him, he was 8 years old. Now he's about 9.5. He lives at Woodstock Farm Sanctuary. His best friend is Marcia. She's 600 pounds, which is small to his maybe 900 pounds, since everyone always asks how much he weighs. Pigs aren't intended to get this big. Intended in the sense of what we intended to do with this pig, which was a pig roast before he was 6 months old. Pigs are born into large litters, and their mother will introduce them to her social group when they're about 10 days old. Ari's first weeks, by contrast, were probably solitary because he was taken from his mother and being kept by members of a fraternal lodge in New Jersey. He escaped. He was 10 weeks old. He ran into a forest and remained there for weeks, foraging, sleeping alone. Pigs can be very inconspicuous in the forest, surprisingly, partly because we no longer imagine pigs in forests, and we don't look at forests as though we might find pigs in them. But he was eventually spotted by someone who took him to the sanctuary to live out his life. So in profiling Ari, my method is first-person observation. I got to visit him. And here, importantly, I relied upon reports of those who tend to him and do see his everyday. But also, part of thinking about who he is at that size and living a life that most pigs do not live, I'm thinking about what it's like to be a pig in an industrialized food setting. Nearly all the pigs in the world live in intensive farming environments. In Hong Kong, there's a 26-story building that houses over 500,000 pigs who spend their entire lives on concrete. They don't feel fresh air. They don't feel earth under their hooves. They can't root. They can't cool or warm themselves. They can't make a nest or find a place to scratch an itch. They can't form a normal social group. Pigs are very olfactory, so the odors of an intensive farming situation, the stress of pigs and their waste must be overwhelming. Pigs don't have good vision right in front of their face like we do. So they see more in their periphery. So a pig who is perceived to be bulky or difficult is more likely one who's reluctant to enter a shadowy space where they can't see. Given a choice, they prefer that the lights are left on. The lights are rarely left on. So I spent several days watching Ari feel fresh air, feel earth under his hooves, root, cool himself in a mud puddle, scratch and itch against a fence, hang with his friends, sniff the breeze, experience the pleasures of a place designed for him. Oh, I do have a little, like, ASMR of a pig eating oak leaves. The profile is partly about the ordinariness of what he's doing all day and how unusual that ordinariness is now. Okay. Another reason that some animals haven't been subjects of biographical portraits is that they were bred to be used in scientific research. This is another use that defines their life out of their hands. Their life is in our hands. They live because of us, and they're here to be used by us. And so we don't need to consider them, or their lives are in service to a research question. It might be a question of how to slow the progress of dementia, of whether exercise leads to neuronal growth, of where empathy comes from, by seeing whether, for instance, a rat will attempt to free a trapped conspecific, even without reward. They will, by the way. So I'm writing about two of what are called lab rats. Lab rats, right? That really underlines what we think they are for, what their lives are for. The breed of these rats is sold by Charles River Labs, the biggest distributor in the US. And they're sold as infants or as pregnant mothers about to have a litter. Surprisingly, they distribute stuffed plush toys of the Sprague Dolly rats. Here's one, just for your consideration. It's only in the last 100 years that they've been making this rat. In 1925, a chemist had the idea to mate a female of one breed called Wistar with a hooded male rat of unusual size and vigor, and then to mate that male with his female offspring for 7 generations, which is usually how breeding happens. And that led to this so-called Sprague Dolly rat, surnames of the chemist who had the idea and his wife's maiden name. Sprague Dolly rats are outbred, meaning they're not all genetically identical. That's not the case with some rats bred for research, but they come from the same closed colony, so they're essentially all cousins. In the Charles River catalog, they're described as being known for their calm demeanor, adaptability, and genetic reliability, ideal for safety and efficacy testing, aging nutrition, diet-induced obesity, oncology, surgical model, a general multi-purpose model. These rats that I'm writing about, like most lab rats, live in a cage, in a tower of cages, in a room for science, in a building on a university campus. A room, a building, and a campus that they're never meant to leave. Their story is subsumed by the story of the research they are unwitting participants in. They're mentioned in the published paper describing the science, wrought from their lives, but just barely. Researchers will often not say more than just the number and breed of the rats that were used, maybe their age or their sex. Usually they'll say the light-dark cycle that they live their life in and how much water and food they're given and maybe their bedding. Often not how they're euthanized at the end of the study. The rats I'm writing about got lucky, relatively, 3 times. The first time, they were assigned to the training program to be the rats used to train people experimenting with rats how to deal with rats. So they're kind of lab rats for lab rats, in a way. The reason I say this is lucky is that it meant they could have their second bit of good fortune, which is that they were requested for a second study. There they are. They were called 253079 and 253080. Their study was looking at whether there are any salutary effects of giving lab rats larger enclosures. A slight unluckiness was that they were assigned to the control condition, but the lucky was that this was run by an animal welfare scientist, and she was not at all keen to euthanize them at the end of the study, as they're meant to be. You've finished your tool, the tool is, life is completed. So most lab rats have two acts, right? Their birth and then their use. These had a third act. They were adopted out and lived a year with these humans with their new given names, Aggie and Gizmo. I wasn't able to meet these rats. They both died a few years ago. But my profile relies on these individuals who, as pets, came to know them, and also the hours upon hours of research footage which shows them living their life before they became named. Okay. Some animals haven't really been subjects of biographical portraits as they're thought of as foreigners, not indigenous, invasive. Thus, they're thought of as an environmental problem, their use of resources impinging on our use of resources. They're overpopulators, they're destroying our environment, and so they should be destroyed. Think of deer, or feral hogs, or the spotted lanternfly. And so you don't need to consider them except as agents of chaos. In New York, we're considered to kill any lanternfly we see, right? They're not from here. This kind of sounds familiar. So here I'm profiling a wild horse. That's a band of bachelor horses in Wyoming. Horses are in Wyoming and Nevada and Utah in the arid plains and deserts of the American West because very few of us are there. They live in places that we've found inhospitable. They preceded us here. The genus Equus appeared 4 million years ago in North America. They roamed the grasslands, and some roamed right over the Bering Land Strait into Asia. There are two stories of the horse from here. In the first, during the advance and retreat of ice across the continent, and as hunting humans appeared, they, like the mammoths and the mastodons and the giant ground sloths and saber-toothed cats, vanished by about 12,000 years ago. And then in 1493, their descendants of their ancestors from Asia returned to North America with colonialists. 25 escaped from a ship from Iberia, and this led eventually to the current population in the US. In the second story, they didn't all hoof it over the Bering Land Bridge. Some of them stayed, and it's possible that the current population has some ancestors who date all the way back to 4 million years ago. Why does it matter? Because invasive animals have no particular rights afforded by the government. They're invasive if they've been domesticated, and then these are the wild descendants of domesticated animals. Horses do have some protection, you might know, from the 1971 Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act, via the Bureau of Land Management, which stewards 250 acres of public land in the western US, which is now home to about 70,000 horses and 8 million cows. So the horse I profiled lived on a herd management area of 200,000 acres, where the BLM just wants there to be 100 horses. But there are more than 100 horses there, so they're rounded up. And they're rounded up by being harassed by helicopters into a pen. This is the horse that I am profiling, 7948, where they're separated from their mare and gelded vaccinated, and then put up for adoption or sent out to pasture in very large private pastures that now house most of the wild horse population in the US. This is often kind of the end of the story for most, but because there are avid horse enthusiasts, some wild horses have been sort of trapped and their fate of being rounded up was known. And this one, named Stargazer, got adopted by a woman called Melissa with his mare, as a matter of fact, named Nora. And here I am being licked by my subject. That also could be a pro or con difference between an animal and a human subject. He lives with his mare, Nora, and a domestic horse called Reuben in a white picket fenced pasture and walks through a forest on harness. Some animals haven't been the subjects of biographical portraits as they're simply too small. We can't be bothered with very, very little things, as though scale were something qualitative, something about merit, not just what it is, the amount of space their body takes up. And so we don't need to consider them. Their lives are barely lives at all. We might even question if they are animals at all. The trickiest thing about this subject is that it's a big imaginative leap to get what it's like to be them. They're microscopic. On the page, about 25 would fit into that period, but now it's been projected, maybe 75, 100. If you've got eyes like an electron microscope, this is what they look like. These are tardigrades. The picture on the left is what most people think they look like, but actually the picture on the right better represents what they mostly look like. They're sometimes called water bears. These are a cosmopolitan animal, as described in biology, which makes them sound like urbane, top-hatted characters. But what it really refers to is their prevalence across climates and continents. They need moisture, but that's about it. And they've been found in volcanoes, rainforests, your storm drain, leaf litter, soil, moss, lichen, hot springs, melted glacier puddles, marine caves, on the green scummy stuff in lakes. And now on the moon, possibly. Tardigrades are called cryptobiotic animals. So when there's extreme hot or cold or extreme dryness or pressure, extreme anything necessary for life, they can will themselves into such a slowed state of being that all metabolic processes essentially cease. A tardigrade contracts their body, retracts their legs, and curls into a little pill bug shape and presses the water from themselves. And this is a suspended state of being called a ton, in which they can survive very challenging conditions for, as far as we know, several decades at least. This is clever, but it means they've become part of the gallery of animals that we experiment with, and the even smaller community of animals who have been sent into outer space. Unlike most, they arrived at the moon. So this shows a picture of the moon before and after the spaceship they were on crashed. But they're somewhere in here, this space. They are nestled in the grooves, in the layers between 25 DVD-sized discs, which was sent on this spaceship as a kind of library of Babel for future intelligent beings to discover on the moon and decipher, I guess. So there's all of Wikipedia, there's the Hebrew Bible, there's a huge amount of literature there. They might be between the grooves representing the definition of tardigrade and the next entry in the encyclopedia. So I am imagining one. I named her Daina for the goddess of the moon. I don't know what species this tardigrade is because no one bothered to note what the species of tardigrades were that they put in these discs and sent to the moon. There are 1,500 tardigrade species, so that's 3 times as many species as in the order primate, which includes, by the way, animals as distinct as the nocturnal tiny insect-eating bush baby and us. So these tardigrades are quite distinct. If you look up at the moon on a clear night, they're within our gaze. What would it mean for us as a species to worry about the thousands of desiccated tardigrades that we've left on the moon? To think it important to find them and return them safely to Earth, releasing them onto a slimy rock in a gentle stream. Here are some of the other kind of reasons that subjects might not be subject to a profile. And encompass animals that I'm just starting to write about, and maybe you have thoughts about other animals who would fit the bill here. One is that there are some animals who we just categorically describe as pests. This is similar to invasive animals, but not entirely overlapping. They cause damage. We don't want them where they are. And so we're certainly not considering the course of their life. Another reason why they might not be considered is because we think that they're not smart, right? Or at least that's the claim. This is really a cognitive question and something that I deal with a lot in my science. The aim to determine what it is that makes humans so uniquely smart and distinguish us from non-humans. A fruitless endeavor in my mind. But that might be also one reason that we don't pay them any mind. Another is that they're hard to relate to. In other words, they're so different from us. They have a distributed brain system, for instance, or their sensory experience is entirely different. They echolocate to see, or they smell the world, or they use touch or magnetic fields to navigate. This is really a complaint that we don't know how to relate to them, actually. And so we don't consider them. I guess a final reason I wanted to mention, as a person who's written several books about dogs, I'm very conscious that not being dogs is a reason we don't look at some animals. But even that said, even being dogs can be seen as a demerit. In other words, they're dogs, so they're not deserving anything but a kind of sentimental portrait, or they're pets, not figures who are separable to humans, just accessories of humans. And so one chapter I've written is an obituary for this individual named Finnegan, who I got the pleasure of living with. So what I think I'm doing in my book is something different than what I might do as a scientist. I mean, if given the claim they're not as smart as humans in some capacity, I might say, okay, let's design a study to see how good they are at a task performed with their capacity. Nor am I trying to solve how they should be considered from a cultural perspective, or whether they should have standing legally. Instead, I'm addressing each of these points with a story of a life, hoping to show that the life itself is the answer to why we should consider them. Thank you.